G'day Poetry Geeks, I'm Jackson and this is another poetry show. In this poetry show we're going to be talking about the materials you need to be an excellent poet and whether you really need a Moleskin to succeed. Okay, so really the answer is pretty obvious. It really doesn't matter what you write in to be a poet. So that's the end of the video. However, there are some people who say, quite adamantly, that in order to be a real poet, you have to write everything out by hand because that's how you have a more physical connection with what you've written. You know, like there's some artistic, creative magic that happens when you're holding a pen in your hand as opposed to typing at a keyboard. And there might be something in that. There is some psychology behind the idea of things like embodied cognition, where you, your mind works with the physical experiences that you have. So there could be something in that, the idea that by using your hand to write something, you're having to translate that language through your body, and that may make some neural pathways and some neural connections that might spark off something a little bit more creative. Possibly. I'm not saying that's definitely true. It could just be kind of pseudo-neuroscientific codswallop. But some people are adamant that you need to write things down by hand. Other people find that they actually just get into the zone a lot more quickly if they just type away at the keyboard. Most people tend to type a lot faster than they can write by hand, and that means their thoughts can flow a little bit quicker, a little bit more like real speech. So I'm a little bit on the fence as to which one is the best. For me personally, it doesn't even come into it what's best. For me, what it comes down to is what is available. If you can hear that little clicking sound, by the way, that's my dog walking around my ankles. Come, Pence. You want to join me for the video? Yeah. You want to sit down? You want to take a seat? Alright, let's move that out of the way. You can take a seat. Yeah, good doggy. So anyway, for those people who are adamant that you have to write by hand, write with whatever is available to you. You don't need a fancy Moleskin, which some people believe they need because that's what Hemingway used. Psst. You're not Hemingway. But really, just use whatever you've got to hand. So it can be something cheap and nasty that you picked up from the supermarket. It might be something small and compact that fits in a bag or in your pocket. It might be something, that's the same, it might be something that has a little pen with it because that's handy to have. You might have, you know, your little stationery fetishes where you go down to, you know, Typo or some, you know, stationery shop and you buy, you know, a nice fancy one. Or, you know, you might have a nice big one like this to kind of jot your ideas down in. And again, this one is a very kind of fancy, expensive looking one with nice hard cover, which obviously has a little bit more kind of creative magic in it. But obviously all of that's nonsense because none of that really matters. What really matters is that when inspiration hits you, you've got something to write it down in. You don't need this to be a writer. What you need to be a writer is to have something to write with and something to write on you at all times. And I would even go so far as to say that even that's not true, because what I tend to do when I'm out walking my dog, for example, and inspiration hits me like a lightning bolt, as it often does because I'm a creative genius, I don't have a pen or anything on me. I just open up my phone, open up the voice recording app, and I pretend I'm talking to people like I'm a high-powered businessman, but what I'm really doing is reciting my idea for my next wonderful poem into it while I'm walking. And that way, if anybody walks past me and they hear me, they think that I must be, you know, trying to woo some, you know, unapproachable, beautiful woman over the phone with these elegant lines of verse. Or they mind their own business, which is what they should be doing. So is it really that simple? Can we just say that it doesn't matter what you write in as long as you've got something with you? Well, yes and no. There is one other consideration that you should think of, and I'm often reminded of this when I read particular poets, or even when I'm writing my own poetry. Sometimes you find that the poem that you are writing and the lines that you're writing are actually constrained by the page and the type of book that you're writing in. Just to give you an example of that, if I was writing in this one, for example, which is a nice pocket-sized little notebook with a pen, it's got one of those, open up wallets in the back where you can put little notes of paper and stuff. That's all very well and good, but the reason I don't use that for all of my poetry writing most of the time is because the pages are so small and narrow. I feel like my line lengths are constrained by the width of the page. And you see that, I think, sometimes in some kind of greater known poets. I'll take, for example, Tennyson, who, let's see, we've got him up here. If you look at the work of Tennyson, for example, he was known, well, one of the things he's kind of known for, or one of the kind of important artifacts that we have that remain of Tennyson, is these butcher's books that he used to write his poetry in. He used to write the history is a little bit murky on it. Some scholars kind of believe it was his later drafts that ended up in the butcher's book. He didn't do his kind of first drafts in these. But these butcher's books were these long, thin books that he would, they're basically used for kind of keeping accounts in an old shop. And he would write his poems into these. Now, because of that form of them being these long, thin books, probably his most famous poem, or his most renowned poem, is the poem Inmoriam, which was an elegy for the death of his friend Arthur Hallam. If I just bring this up nice and close for you. Okay, you can see that he has these slightly shorter segments. He has these very small stanzas, just 4-line stanzas all the way through, all these quatrains. They follow this kind of usual this little rhyme scheme that he has. But I think in writing in such a sort of narrow, long book, he writes a narrow, long poem. And it goes on and on and on. There are pages and pages and pages, and this one is just an excerpt. But it's a very long poem, and it's a very thin poem. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider, how much of what he wrote was helped or influenced by the nature of the thing that he was writing in. So I tend to find that I can't actually write a full long poem in something like this because I feel like I've never got enough room to really explore. So when I'm writing my first drafts of anything, the two books I kind of use more generally are this one for jotting down, kind of brainstorming ideas, snatches of lines that I kind of squeeze together, because you've got more room in here to do that. And then this one as well, I just tend to write smaller, but I do the same thing. And the idea behind that is basically, if you've got room to write and you've got room to make mistakes, then that actually gives you a bit of flexibility and a bit of fluidity. So I'm not saying you absolutely have to write on a big page as opposed to a small page, but that is something to consider. Just in the back of your mind, think, what kind of effect does that kind of constraint of space have on you as a poet? Because it will have some influence. And it's okay to be influenced as a poet. Everything influences us. So it's important to understand where those influences come from, whether they're working for you or against you, and then taking appropriate measures to deal with that. Similarly with, if you're writing all of your poems in Word documents or in Notepad, there are typographical kind of positioning things that happen when you're writing that are kind of dictated to you by the software that you're using. So again, you might think, well, do the constraints of that software stop you from expressing yourself in a particular way, or do they help you express yourself in a different way? So those are the kinds of things that you can keep in the back of your mind as well. So on the one hand, it seems like a very, very straightforward answer to the question, does it matter what materials you use? Do you need a particular type of pencil? Do you need a particular type of notebook? Do you need, a particular type of software on your computer that you write your poems in that, does whatever kind of software-y poetic magic might be out there? Does any of that stuff matter? Not really. If you're going to write, you're going to write. And I often used to write on the back of bus tickets or receipts that I had in my pocket, just whatever I had to hand. I'd just stuff them all into my wallet. I'd pull them out at a later date and I'd write them down in a proper notebook. But you just write on whatever you've got. But when you are composing something, when you're putting together your ideas, when you're trying to give them some shape and some structure, you might want to think about the constraints that that page is placing on you and the influence that might have on you. So I do have one Moleskin, by the way. Moleskin? Moleskin or Moleskine? Who knows? I do have one Moleskin. I don't like to write in it very much though, because, you know, they're such beautiful things. They're such beautiful, pristine, elegant pieces of, I mean, this is a work of art in itself, so I don't feel like I can write in it. And it also has this other quirk where if you, whenever you open it to write in it, I mean, that's just distracting. So really, I don't know what the deal is with these. Oh, you're a good little girl, aren't you, Pants? Yeah, you show me your belly. You show me your belly. You just sit there and don't be annoying.